What's going on, everyone? My name is Connor, and on this channel I've been ranking and reviewing each of the Ticket to Ride boards, and today is no different. Today, I'll be talking about...
Wow, look at him go. He's doing it. Wow.
Ticket to Ride, Nordic Countries. Now, as you can see, I've gotten into the spirit of the game by coming out here to the great outdoors. My hand is wet now. Shit. Now, I've always had an appreciation for the Nordic countries because of their progressive social welfare programs. In the Nordic countries, you don't have to think before calling an ambulance, and you get to go to college for free, which is pretty ironic because this is known as maybe the meanest and most cutthroat of all the Ticket to Ride boards. If we take a look at the rule set makeup of these games in this cool little graph that I made, you can see that Nordic Countries checks the most brutal boxes. We've got tunnels, ferries, route car deletion, and the locomotives only being able to be used for tunnels and ferries mechanic. It has almost the same exact rule set as Switzerland, including the fact that it's only up to 3 players, but it does have 2 key differences. For one, there is no countries mechanic in Nordic countries. Kinda ironic. And secondly, the board looks like this. What the fuck is this, Alan? Like, Mr. Moon, level with me here. What the hell am I looking at? Ticket to Ride Nordic Countries is essentially Ticket to Ride Prepare to Get Blocked to Die edition. But even though the game is completely brutal, it does throw its players a few bones in order to make the game a bit more manageable, including, from what I can tell, is the most heavily debated rule in the history of Ticket to Ride. I'm going to read the rule word for word, but before I do, I need to catch you up on how locomotives work in Nordic countries. Locomotives in this game can be taken as normal train cards. So if you take one locomotive, you can still take another train card. However, locomotives can only be used for ferries and tunnels in this game. With that out of the way, we can get to the 2 most heavily debated sentences I've ever seen in a Ticket to Ride rulebook. A player can play additional locomotive cards as a substitute for a color card. This is referring to ferries, or when you're taking a ferry. Any 3 cards can be used as a substitute for a locomotive card. The debate around this rule is that if you can substitute 3 cards for a locomotive card, and you can use extra locomotive cards to fill in an extra color space for a ferry, can you substitute 3 color cards as a locomotive to substitute those 3 cards for 1 space of a ferry? There are some pretty hefty board game geek threads about this, people saying that they asked Alan themselves, and then someone else chiming in literally 15 years later saying that that is actually wrong, because that's not actually Alan himself speaking in the thread. Alan's rule is that you would not be able to do this, and that's how it works on the online app, while the community consensus seems to be that you should be able to do this. Now, first of all, this is why you definitely want someone to read your rulebooks before you sell 1,000,000 copies of your game. By the way, I'm available for work. The wording, in my opinion, implies that you should be able to replace a color space with 3 of any card, but mechanically, it feels like you shouldn't be able to. What the rulebook, I assume, is trying to say is that you can replace a ferry slot with 3 of any card, but as it reads now, it basically says that you could use those 3 cards to replace any locomotive. In the end, I think you and your playgroup should just choose whichever ruling you like more. I can see both interpretations of this being pretty valid. That's not the game's only replacement mechanic. A player is able to use 4 of any color cards to replace 1 of any color card for one of the longest routes in Ticket to Ride, the 9-train-long Lexa to Murmansk route, worth a wholly 27 points. This is a great way to burn out your trains near the end of the game, and I always love a nice 8 or 9 length route in the game for that exact reason. That being said, the game does actually have some pretty mean mechanics as well, such as removing destination tickets from the game that you choose not to keep. This was a mechanic in Switzerland that I didn't quite touch on too much, since that game's routes were, pretty questionable. I think this mechanic is definitely interesting though, and works really well here. Since the Nordic countries map is pretty small and the game is limited to 3 players, being able to redraw through the deck could get potentially dicey. Even though Switzerland features the same discarding route cards mechanic as Nordic Countries, it didn't quite fix the problem that the mechanic was trying to prevent. Since the boards in these games are so much smaller, you can go fishing for cards and you'll find many routes that line up nicely with where you already are. In Switzerland, I think this failed because the country cards were just so overbearingly broken. You only ever had one chance to pull them, and whoever pulled them seemed to win. With Nordic Countries though, the deletion of route cards makes way more sense. It prevents players from fishing for the best route cards in the game that they were too scared to take early. It forces the players to put up or shut up, and I think for this gnarly game, it works out in its favor. Plus, you can remove destination tickets other players may want and know that those players won't have access to them for the rest of the game, which is a pretty unique layer of depth created from one simple rule change. Now, with all the rules out of the way, I think it's time we bring this entire Snow Week package together and talk about it. How is it? Holy fuck. Holy shit. As I said before, Ticket to Ride Nordic Countries is amongst the most brutal of the Ticket to Ride maps. Old West, I think, is probably the meanest, but Nordic Countries definitely still takes the cake for being the rudest. Not only are there several game-ending choke points, but it's also one of, if not the smallest Ticket to Ride board. Shoutouts to Neil Thompson for his in-depth review of Nordic Countries on Board Game Geek, as I'll be using a lot of his stats during my discussion in the following section. Nordic Countries features only 70 routes, 5 less than Switzerland, and a little over half of its routes are a length of 1 or 2. Importantly, a lot of those 1 or 2 length routes are choke points. This board seems to have 3 central lines running through it, one in the west, one in the middle, and one in the east. This is pretty standard for ticket boards. Where Nordic Countries seems to deviate with these though, is that there are not many ways of getting from the west to the middle, or the middle to the east. Östersund to Sundsvall and Narvik to Kiruna are your only ways of getting from the west side of the board to the middle, without having to go all the way around to the bottom of the board. In 2-player games, Narvik to Kiruna can only be taken on one side, making it absolutely brutal if it's blocked. On that side too, we have Moirana to Narvik and Narvik to Tromsø. An absolutely horrifying combination of 2 routes that are vital for any player taking the west coast down. Narvik might just take the cake for the sketchiest city in the entire series, due to every route going into it being scary as hell. The middle to the east of the board isn't much better, with your only main ways of transferring over not being at the bottom of the board, being Boden to Torino, Umeå to Vasa, and Sundsvall to Vasa. These are another horrifying set of routes that can pretty much end your game in an instant. And if you've noticed, only one of these routes has a length greater than 2, making each of them very easy to take. I overall think that this works as a positive for the game. One thing that Neil Thompson pointed out in his analysis that I think is really important is the idea that since so much of the board is covered in 1 or 2 length routes, quick exchanges of pieces will happen often. This is when Ticket to Ride feels the most interactive, when players are quickly exchanging routes around each other and just hoping that the other player doesn't have the resources that they need in order to take that one really important route. I will say though that the downside of the game being so brutal is that it allows for the classic Ticket to Ride turn 1 screw over. This is my biggest problem with the America map, where you essentially can be put multiple turns behind before you even get to take a move. And I think that problem is alleviated a bit here, since this map is so insane that it's not uncommon for multiple players to get screwed and lose points from route cards, but it's a case that can still happen. This is overall more of a ticket-wide problem, and I think for what it's worth, this has been the best implementation of a get screwed type of board. The destination tickets are also pretty solid in this game. Shoutouts to Neil Thompson again, who's provided a lot of great data and analytics in his review of the game. Honestly, just go read his written review. I don't even know why I'm making this, dude. Neil Thompson, you were the man! Almost every destination card in the game connects to a city on the southern end of the board. Only 1 card in the entire game is a north to north route. 24 out of the 46 ticket cards in the game connect 2 cities on the south of the map, and 22 routes feature at least 1 city in the south. This means that everyone is going to be going to the same place, similar to Germany and Markland. I think this route distribution is actually super solid, since half the routes are essentially short routes. If a player gets stuck at the bottom of the board, they're still able to play the game through the Globetrotter bonus card. I've seen a viable short route strategy work in this game, and I definitely think that's an accomplishment. I also love how barren the board gets near the top. It's one of the only games in the series where the theme really comes out. It feels like you're actually getting further and further from civilization as you head north. In addition, long routes actually feel risky in this game, since the game is so cutthroat, and that is a warm welcome. Last but not least, visually, this game is incredible. I've never seen players talk so much about the visuals of a Ticket to Ride, but in every review of this game, it's commented on. Santa on the front of the game, the snow cards, and of course my favorite thing, the details on the board are amongst my favorite of all of the Ticket to Ride maps. And don't let me forget that most importantly, you can play as purple in this one. Now to talk about a not so warm welcome addition to the game, which is how the locomotives work. Now I think this is just how locomotives work in the 3-player Ticket to Ride games because it worked the same way in Switzerland, but I didn't like it in that game and I don't like it here either. Because locomotives can only be used for tunnels and ferries, you'll have to always get the exact amount of color cards you need to take a route. I like how in most games, if you need a card and it's not there, but a locomotive is, you can give up the extra card draw for the card you need immediately. Without that though, there's not always a reason to take them, and in this case, you get stuck in the everyone taking 2 cards from the top loop quite often. If the card you need isn't there, you just have to give in to luck to see if you draw the resource you need.
Cool. Me too. I'm never gonna get what I want. Never!
And I think that clashes with the cutthroat feeling that this game is going for. In addition to that, I also wish that the 3-card replacement mechanic for ferries was also a rule for tunnels. As in, if you don't have the extra cards to make up for the cards that you drew for the tunnel, you could discard 3 of any cards to make up for the extra drawn card. It seems weird to me that one route essentially got this rule, but one of the main mechanics of the game, a mechanic that people complain about quite often, by the way, doesn't get the same luxury. I think this could potentially be a great change to the mechanic, but hey, maybe Alan tested it himself and it was actually horrible. Again, I'd never say that I could do it better than the man himself. And that's it for my thoughts and critiques on Ticket to Ride Nordic Countries, so now it's time to bring up the old tier list and rank this baby. Nordic Countries is going to go into the S tier, but just barely, okay? It barely squeaked in there. I really wanted to put it in the A tier. Also, I know that it's a very top-heavy tier list as of right now, but I have to get through the good ones to get to the bad ones, so it won't be staying this way, I promise. Ticket to Ride Nordic Countries is a fan favorite, and for good reason. It lays on the gas right away and doesn't look back. It is tense from the very first turn, where a lot of other Ticket to Ride games take a lot of time to build that tension, and it doesn't really get tense until the mid to end game. That being said, I feel like I've always liked Nordic Countries a little bit less than most people. I really don't like the way that locomotives work in this game, and the fact that some of the rules are still disputed to this day is pretty ridiculous. I'm also just not sure that sheer brutality really works in Ticket to Ride, and I'm saying this as someone whose favorite board game is Root. Brutality in board games is not what I have an issue with, but getting turn 1 cheesed does kind of feel like garbage, and I feel like this game has a pretty high potential for that. But I will say, out of the attempts to make a cutthroatiness Ticket to Ride, that this game is definitely the best attempt Alan has ever done, and I have to give it its flowers for that. But honestly, what bumps this game into the S tier for me is just how artistically beautiful it is. I used to get a Ticket to Ride every Christmas with my family, and the fact that this game kind of leans into that honestly kind of touches my heart. This game makes me feel nostalgic, and it makes me feel something that the other Ticket to Rides don't, which I think is really impressive. You feel like you're in the cold. It feels like shit. Like, it feels bad. Like, it's scary. You are freezing, dude. I'm freezing right now recording this. Why am I doing this? I really cannot deny that this is one of the best Ticket to Ride experiences that you could ask for. It gives such a stylistically different version of the game that I think some people should definitely try out. If you're not a fan of the game because it's too, light and it's a family game, I think you should try this one out because this one causes some family arguments. So overall, Ticket to Ride Nordic Countries is getting thrown in the S tier. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind throwing a like or a subscription, that would be sick. It gives me dopamine straight to the dome. Like literally, if you want to directly make my day fantastic, doing any of those things is very appreciated. The next video I think is finally gonna be the root video, as it is my birthday month, and I've been grinding on that thing, at least the scripts, for a while. So I think it's time to finally pull the trigger. It's gonna take me a while, so hopefully I will see you in March with the root ranking video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.